this wasn't a single crime. This was a century of evil, festering in plain sight. For 5 generations, one family built a nightmare world on a remote mountain, and it took one brave child to finally bring it all down. There are cases that linger in the mind, haunting me for months before I find the courage to bring them to this channel. Cases so profoundly disturbing, so viscerally revolting, that even I, after years of investigating the darkest crimes, must pause and question if I should truly share this with you. And today's case is one of those. For months, my notes on the Goler clan sat before me, and a single question echoed in my mind: are people ready for this? Am I ready to tell this story? Because what unfolded in South Mountain, in the Canadian province of Nova Scotia, from the years 1860 to 1984, feels impossible. It reads like a piece of poorly written horror fiction. It seems like a grotesque exaggeration of human evil. But it is not. This is real. It is documented, tried in court, and stands as possibly the most sinister case I have ever brought to this channel. We are speaking of 5 generations of a single family, living in total seclusion, perpetuating cycles of violence that defy all comprehension. A family where over 15 adults actively participated in crimes against at least 13 children. South Mountain is a region of wild, untamed beauty in Nova Scotia. In the 1980s, few paved roads cut through that dense, enveloping vegetation. And there, removed from the eyes of society, certain families had lived for generations in near-complete isolation. One of these families bore the name Goler. For more than a century, that name echoed through those mountains as a synonym for poverty, ignorance, and bitter segregation. To the residents of neighboring towns, the Golers were simply those strange mountain people. The children who arrived at school dirty, the adults who rarely ventured down into the valley. But in January of 1984, when a 14-year-old girl finally found the courage to speak, the world would discover the horrifying reality festering inside that isolated house on Deep Hollow Road. What was revealed would forever change how Canada viewed the crimes hidden within its rural communities. This is not an easy story to tell, and I warn you, it will not be easy to hear. But it is a story that must be told. For as long as we choose to look away from the evil hiding in the forgotten corners of our society, that very evil will continue to thrive. So, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below. And if this is your first time with us, subscribe to the channel. What comes next is an investigation that cannot, and must not, be forgotten. The Goler clan case is a brutal reminder that our worst nightmares are not found in horror films. They are in real places, happening to real people, while everyone around them chooses not to see. And this particular nightmare began with one brave girl who decided that silence was no longer an option. The road climbing up South Mountain was little more than a dirt path, narrow, winding, surrounded by trees so thick they blocked the sunlight even at midday. Few ever ventured up there without a specific, unavoidable reason. The region, for all its natural beauty, carried an ominous reputation among the inhabitants of the valley below. Since the mid-19th century, marginalized families had found a desperate refuge on those slopes. They were people who didn't fit into the orderly society of Nova Scotia's coastal cities. Some were fleeing debts, others were fleeing the law. Many simply had nowhere else to go. And among these families was the Goler clan, their roots on the mountain stretching all the way back to 1860. The original patriarch, Silas Goler, had arrived in the region fleeing slavery in the United States during the War of 1812. His wife, Amelia, had also escaped bondage. Together, they crossed the border into Canada, seeking freedom. But the freedom they found on South Mountain was a relative one. The rocky, sloping soil was unsuitable for extensive agriculture. Mountain families survived by hunting, fishing, and gathering what meager offerings the forest provided. In the winter, the cutting cold made life almost unbearable. Over the ensuing decades, the Golers remained apart, not just geographically, but socially, utterly detached. By the 1970s, when the heart of our story unfolds, the valley below had prospered. Towns like Kentville and Wolfville had become vibrant commercial centers. But South Mountain remained frozen in a grim, bygone time. Locating the Goler property on Deep Hollow Road was a difficult task. There were no signs, no visible numbers, no clear indications of civilization. Occasional visitors would describe a profoundly disturbing sight, a grey, weathered wooden house, surrounded by rusted vehicle skeletons, piles of trash, and a vegetation that seemed intent on swallowing everything whole. The main structure was an old construction, expanded over the years with improvised, shoddy additions. The exterior walls were tar paper, windows were without glass, covered instead with flapping plastic sheets. The roof had given way in several places, patched haphazardly with oxidized metal sheets. More than 30 people lived inside that squalor. Charles Goler and his wife Stella commanded the family. Both in their 50s by 1980, they had raised 9 children on that wretched property. But the children never left. They married each other, or they married cousins, and their own children grew up within the same deteriorating walls. William Goler, born in 1945, was the shrewdest of Charles and Stella's children. Not the strongest physically, nor the oldest, but undoubtedly the most manipulative. While his siblings could barely articulate complete sentences, William spoke with a relative, cunning clarity. While the others passively accepted their miserable conditions, William's eyes were always looking for opportunities. During the 1970s, William began to gradually assume control over the clan. His mother, Stella, had always protected him, defending him against any criticism. His father, Charles, was already debilitated and tired. William's brothers, Henry, Cranwick, and Seal, lacked either the ambition or the intelligence to challenge him. Seal, incidentally, was paralyzed from the waist down, confined to an improvised wheelchair. Even so, he remained in the house, entirely dependent on the family for his care. William's sisters, Stella Jr., Marjorie, Josephine, and Mary, had married within the clan itself, or with men from neighboring mountains. All of them remained within the grim orbit of the family property. Inside the house, the conditions were indescribable. Running water was non-existent. A simple hole in the floor served as a toilet. Old, stained mattresses, scattered through the rooms, were shared by dozens of people. There was no real furniture, just car seats ripped from abandoned vehicles and nailed to wooden boards. Trash accumulated in every corner. And one of the daily tasks imposed on the youngest members perfectly exemplified the sheer absurdity of their existence. Every day, they were forced to collect the debris that accumulated around the house and yard, empty packages, food scraps, dirty diapers, broken objects, and carry it all up into the attic. The attic was dark, moldy, and infested with rats. They would climb the precarious stairs, carrying bags and piles of trash, stacking everything right up to the ceiling. Eventually, the attic would become too full. There was simply no more space. Then the adults would order them to bring all that very same trash back down and throw it into the yard. They obeyed. They carried the same stinking bags down the stairs, dumping everything into the tall grass. The yard would become covered with trash, mountains of debris rotting under the sun. After a few weeks, the adults would order them to collect the trash from the yard and take it all back up to the attic. And so the cycle began again. No logic. No purpose. It was useless, repetitive, endless work. But it served an invisible, sinister purpose. It kept the youngest occupied, exhausted, and utterly drained of any energy to question or to resist. It was control through absurdity. Hygiene was non-existent. Without running water, baths were a rare event. They went to school dirty, wearing worn and foul-smelling clothes. Teachers noticed, but they rarely intervened. After all, they were the Golers. Everyone knew they were different. In the Valley community, the Goler name was synonymous with scorn. To call someone a Goler was a serious insult. The clan's youngest members suffered constant bullying at school. They were called dirty, stupid, weird. But what nobody knew, or what nobody wanted to know, was what truly happened inside that remote mountain house. Because the poverty and the filth were merely the surface. Beneath it, something infinitely darker was festering. Since 1860, when Silas and Amelia Goler first settled on South Mountain, something had begun to deviate in the family lineage. There are no clear records of when exactly the incest began, but later genealogical analyses would reveal a deeply disturbing pattern. Successive generations showed unmistakable signs of severe inbreeding. Experts documented a legacy of physical deformities, mental disabilities, extremely low IQs, learning difficulties, and speech problems. Everything indicated that for at least 5 generations, the Golers had been reproducing among close relatives. William and his siblings were direct products of this inbreeding. All had dropped out of school before the 5th grade. Most were functionally illiterate. Later IQ tests would place almost all of them in the bottom 2% of the population. And there were even darker consequences of this prolonged inbreeding. Over the decades, babies were born with deformities so severe they didn't survive more than a few days or weeks. Others were stillborn. These babies were never officially registered, they never received death certificates. They simply disappeared. There is strong evidence they were buried somewhere on the property. Perhaps out back where the forest swallowed everything, perhaps scattered across the mountain. Official records mention at least 3 documented infant deaths in the Goler family over the years, but investigators suspect the real number is significantly higher. Generations of babies, born from consanguineous relations, condemned before even taking their first breath, buried in unconsecrated ground, without names, without mourning, without a memory. It was yet another layer of horror in a family built upon buried secrets. But there was something more, something that transcended genetics and poverty. There was a culture of violence and control that permeated every single aspect of life within the Goler clan. And when William assumed control in the 1970s, that culture intensified dramatically. William was married to Hazel Pinch, a young woman from a neighboring family. Hazel was only 16 when she was forced into the marriage. She had no choice. In that community's deeply patriarchal culture, women did not decide whom they married. Together, William and Hazel had 3 daughters, Sandra, born in 1970, Donna in 1972, and Lisa in 1976. These 3 girls would grow up at the very epicenter of the horror. William quickly established his authority through fear. He kept an attack dog named Shiva, a mistreated and aggressive animal he deliberately provoked to make it even more violent. The youngest were terrorized by the dog, and William used this as a tool of control. If a young one disobeyed, William would threaten to release it. And these were not empty threats. There were occasions when the dog was indeed released to attack. They would run, scream, and try to hide. Some were bitten. Others just lived with the constant, gnawing terror that it could happen at any moment. William also established a system of forced labor. All capable adults were required to seek temporary jobs down in the valley. At the end of the week, they would hand their wages over to William, who supposedly managed the resources. Meanwhile, William himself didn't work. He claimed illnesses and disabilities, receiving government benefits. But he was perfectly physically capable. He also decided who could or could not enter the clan. When someone married a family member, William would evaluate whether the outsider would be accepted. Most were rejected. William controlled which young ones went to school. He only allowed some to attend because the family's social benefits depended on it. Otherwise, no child would have ever left that property. For those who did go to school, those hours away from home were a precious respite. Even while facing bullying and humiliation, school was a refuge. There, at least, nobody hurt them physically. There were teachers who spoke gently. There were books. There were clean windows that let the light in. There was heating in the winter. There was a glimpse of normalcy. And there was food. One teacher in particular, who taught elementary school, noticed that the Goler youngsters arrived at school visibly hungry. He noticed how they stared at other children's lunchboxes, how they ate too quickly during recess, as if afraid the food would disappear. This teacher began discreetly to pay for the Goler children's school meals. He didn't make a fuss, he didn't ask for recognition. He just ensured that at least once a day, those young ones had hot food in their stomachs. For them, that daily meal was more than physical nutrition. It was proof that not all adults were cruel. It was evidence that kindness existed. It was hope. But that hope ended the moment the school bus dropped them back off on Deep Hollow Road. because at home, the violence was constant. William and the other adult men would beat the children for any reason: a wrong look, a poorly done task, an insolent response. They frequently appeared at school with visible bruises, split lips, black eyes. But the teachers, for the most part, did nothing. They were the Golers. What could be expected? William had his favorite punishment. He would take a child to one of the rusted cars in the yard. He would order them to place their hands in the trunk opening, and then he would slam the heavy lid down hard on their small fingers. The sound was horrible. A crack, followed by screams. Some had broken fingers. Others just had deep bruises under their nails that took weeks to disappear. William called this a lesson. He said it was to teach them to obey. There was another occasion when William took Sandra, his oldest daughter, and pushed her into the narrow, searing space between the wood stove and the wall. The stove was lit. The heat was intense. Sandra was trapped there, unable to move, feeling her skin burn and her hair singe. William left her there until she passed out. When he finally pulled her out, Sandra had second-degree burns and part of her hair was burned away. Nobody took her to a hospital. Nobody properly treated the injuries. Those who lived in this environment were deeply, profoundly traumatized. They never knew what would provoke violence. They walked in silence. They avoided eye contact. They made themselves small, invisible, hoping not to be noticed. And even then, there was no safety. In 1979, something shifted in the clan's dynamics. Hazel, William's wife, decided to have a tubal ligation surgery. She didn't want more children. 3 were more than enough. The surgery required a few days of hospitalization. William was left alone with his daughters and the rest of the family. It was during this period that he met Wanda Winston. Wanda was 20 years old. She came from another mountain family, equally marginalized and dysfunctional. Her own childhood had been marked by violence and neglect. At 18, she had run away from home. She worked briefly as a waitress. At 19, she married a man who abused her. The marriage lasted only 8 months. When she met William, Wanda was vulnerable, aimless, and desperate. William offered her work as a nanny and housekeeper while Hazel was in the hospital. Wanda accepted. From the very first day, it was clear she wasn't there to care for the children or clean the house. The house remained filthy. The children were neglected. What Wanda really did was share the mattress with William. When Hazel returned from the hospital, she expected Wanda to leave. But William had other plans. He informed his wife that Wanda would be staying and that Hazel would have to accept it. From that moment on, 3 people shared the same filthy mattress on the floor. Hazel was forced to witness William and Wanda together, night after night. When she protested, she was beaten. Hazel tried to escape several times, but she always came back. She had no money, nowhere to go, and her daughters were trapped in that house. Finally, in 1980, Hazel had a definitive break. She demanded that William choose her or Wanda. William laughed in her face. He said he wouldn't choose anything, that she could stay and accept it, or she could leave. Hazel left. She got a small apartment in the valley and immediately sought custody of her daughters. She went to court, presented evidence of their extreme poverty, reported the violence. But when the judge analyzed the case, he decided the girls would be better off with their father. William had a house. He had government benefits. The girls were enrolled in school. Hazel was seen as unstable, without resources. The judge granted custody to William. Sandra, Donna, and Lisa would remain on Deep Hollow Road. And Hazel would never see them again. With Hazel out of the way, Wanda assumed a central role in the clan. Gradually, she supplanted even Stella, the original matriarch, becoming second-in-command alongside William. Wanda had a deeply disturbing personality. She carried with her everywhere an old, worn rag doll, frayed yarn for hair, a dirty dress, one of its button eyes missing. She constantly talked to the doll, asked its opinion on decisions, announced punishments through it, using different voices, her own, high-pitched and childlike, and then a deeper voice that supposedly belonged to the doll. The children learned to fear the doll as much as they feared Wanda. Because when Wanda held the doll close to her face and began talking to it, something bad was always about to happen. Wanda also manipulated William through intimacy. She kept him satisfied, and in return, he did everything she commanded. If a child contradicted Wanda, she didn't need to dirty her own hands. Just a gesture, a single word, and William would execute the punishment. The children quickly learned to fear Wanda as much as, or even more than, William. Because with William, at least you knew when he was furious. His face would turn red, his voice would rise. There were signs. Wanda was different. Her face remained calm. Her voice stayed soft and childlike. She would smile while ordering violence. She would hold her doll and whisper with it. And then something terrible would happen. This unpredictability was more frightening than William's obvious fury. It was also in 1980 that the true nature of the Goler clan began to fully reveal itself. Not yet to the outside world, that would only happen years later, but to the victims themselves, who were beginning to understand that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Sandra, William's oldest daughter, was 10 years old. Donna, the middle one, was 8. Lisa, the youngest, was just 4. All three were surrounded by cousins, uncles, aunts. In total, about 13 children lived on the property during that period. The adults of the Goler clan, 15 in total, had established a culture where the young existed solely to serve. They worked on household tasks. They were deprived of food as punishment. They were beaten for the most minimal infractions. But the worst was beyond the physical violence. Because in the Goler clan, the children were also seen as property in another, more horrific sense. Charles Goler, the patriarch, then over 60 years old, maintained inappropriate relations with 2 of his own daughters, Marjorie and Stella Jr. Both became pregnant by him. The babies born were genetically both his children and his grandchildren at the same time. An uncle forced his teenage niece into similar circumstances. When the girl gave birth, she was obligated to hand the baby over to the grandmother, who raised it as if it were the true mother's sibling. These were situations that defied any moral logic, but which, within the Goler clan, were treated as normal. And then there was what happened to the youngest members of the family. William Goler, as clan leader, felt he had the right to do whatever he wanted. And what he wanted was absolute control. Donna, the middle daughter, would be able to remember years later the exact moment her childhood ended. She was very young. It was a day that should have been happy. She had come home excited about starting school. But that afternoon, her father crossed a line that should never, ever be crossed. And from there, it became a routine. Almost daily. There was no escape. Sandra, the oldest, suffered the same. And eventually, even the youngest would be included in this nightmare. But it wasn't just William. All the adult men in the clan, his brothers Henry and Cranwick, his brothers-in-law Roy, Lawrence, Eugene, all participated in these crimes. Cranwick was the most violent. He laughed during the acts. He bragged openly. He showed not a single trace of remorse or shame. Seal, William's paralyzed brother, couldn't physically participate. But William had a role for him, too. When these crimes happened, Seal was wheeled in his wheelchair to the location. Someone would push him through the rooms, positioning him where he had a clear view. And Seal watched. He made guttural sounds, grunts of approval, spasmodic hand movements, expressions that seemed like pleasure. He couldn't touch, but he consumed visually. He was a passive participant, but a participant nonetheless. For the children, Seal's presence was almost as traumatic as the rest, because it added a layer of performance, of spectacle. It wasn't just the crimes themselves, it was the fact that there was an audience, that it was entertainment for those men. The women of the clan knew. They all knew. And none intervened. Some even helped, holding the children down to make it easier. When Wanda arrived, the situation worsened exponentially. Wanda not only tolerated what was happening, she committed atrocities personally, and with a frequency and sadism that shocked even the already desensitized clan. Sandra was her first victim. Wanda would drag her to the bedroom and subject her to unspeakable acts. Then she would force the others to watch, as a form of intimidation and normalization. Donna came next. Then the cousins, Pam, Sally, Annie, all victimized in similar ways. And then there was the youngest daughter, a small child who had barely learned to speak in complete sentences, who still needed help getting dressed, who played with dolls and believed in fairy tales. She, too, became a victim. Wanda also targeted the boys, Doug, Matt, Michael, Jeff. None were spared. There was no distinction, no mercy. Wanda used objects as weapons. She threatened. She beat the children with pieces of bicycle tire when they disobeyed. She invented sadistic punishments. And, most disturbingly, Wanda invited the family men to watch while she acted. She turned these crimes into public spectacles. William was an avid viewer. Sometimes he participated along with her. But there was yet another layer of sadism. The adults weren't content with being the only perpetrators. They forced the children themselves to become instruments of harm against each other. Older boys, 12 or 13 years old, were coerced into hurting younger girls, not by their own will, but under severe threats from William and the other men. If they refused, they would be beaten, or worse, the dog would be released. So they obeyed, and they carried that guilt for the rest of their lives. Teenage cousins were forced to participate in acts with younger cousins while the adults watched and gave instructions. The older ones cried while they did it. The younger ones didn't understand why those who should protect them were hurting them. It was a deliberate strategy of psychological destruction. William and the other adults knew exactly what they were doing. They turned victims into perpetrators. They ensured no child felt innocent, that all carried a burden of shame and guilt. And in doing so, they eliminated any possibility of solidarity among the children. Because how can you trust someone who also hurt you? Even if that person was forced, even if they were also a victim, it was a system of complete imprisonment. Each child was left alone in their own particular hell. But not even the clan's internal horror was the limit. Because William found a way to profit from the suffering of the children. He began inviting men from outside, neighbors, occasional acquaintances, strangers he crossed paths with, up to the property. The process was systematic and repugnant. William would gather the children. He made them stand in a line, side by side, against the wall. They were dirty, scared, knowing what was coming. Then the visitor would enter. He would look at the line as if he were choosing merchandise from a shelf. He would point to one, and William would hand them over. And what was the payment for this? What value did William Goler place on a child's dignity and safety? A pack of cigarettes? Sometimes a bottle of beer. Occasionally, a few crumpled dollars. Think about that for a moment. An innocent, defenseless human being, dependent on adult protection, was being traded for less than the cost of a sandwich. This wasn't organized trafficking. It wasn't a sophisticated criminal network. It was a man on a mountain, so morally bankrupt, so completely disconnected from basic humanity, that he saw children as currency for his most venial vices. They were treated as less than merchandise. They were disposable commodities. Objects. And the worst part? This didn't happen in secret. The other family adults knew. They saw. And nobody intervened. But William also invented his own psychological games. One of them became a routine, the mailbox game. In the morning, William would gather all the children in the yard. He would point to the mailbox at the end of the long driveway, and he would announce the rules. The first one to reach the box would be free from physical punishment for that day. They ran. They stumbled in the tall grass. They pushed each other, desperate to win. The winner received their prize, a single day of relative peace. The losers knew exactly what awaited them. And all of this happened in the shadows of South Mountain, utterly invisible to the outside world. Some of the children tried to ask for help. Sandra ran away from home twice. She was found by police on both occasions. She tried to tell them what was happening. The officers simply took her back and didn't investigate a thing. Donna told a teacher. The teacher, instead of contacting the authorities, called William to clarify the situation. William denied everything, said his daughter had mental problems. The teacher believed him. The children were systematically ignored because they were Golers, and nobody wanted to get involved with the Golers. But the silence would not last forever. If you're finding this investigation compelling, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters. What comes next is the turn that would change everything. January 1984 arrived at South Mountain like any other winter. Heavy snow covered the roads. A cutting wind swept the slopes. Inside the Goler house, life continued its dark and predictable course. Sandra was now 14 years old. 14 years of a life marked by uninterrupted suffering. 14 years of witnessing and enduring horrors no child should ever know. But something inside Sandra was changing. Perhaps it was her age. Perhaps it was school, which remained her only contact with a different world. Perhaps it was simply the limit of what a human being can endure. On January 21, 1984, an ordinary Monday, Sandra went to school. Nothing indicated that this day would be any different from all the others. She entered the classroom, sat at her usual desk, tried to pay attention to the lessons. But she couldn't. Something inside her was finally overflowing. When the teacher asked her to solve an exercise on the board, Sandra simply didn't respond. She stood still, staring at nothing. The teacher repeated the request. Sandra remained motionless. Finally, the teacher asked Sandra to leave the room and wait in the hallway. It was a routine punishment. Sandra was frequently expelled from class for disruptive behavior. But this time, when she was alone in the hallway, Sandra began to cry. It wasn't a silent crying. It was uncontrolled, desperate sobbing. All the weight of 14 years of trauma was pouring out at once. The teacher, a woman named Mrs. Henderson who was relatively new to the school, heard the crying and came out to check. What she saw alarmed her. Sandra was huddled against the wall, hugging her knees, trembling violently. Mrs. Henderson knelt beside her. She asked gently what was happening. Sandra lifted her tear-soaked face and said something Mrs. Henderson would never forget. She said her father treated her inappropriately, that he violated boundaries that should never be crossed. Mrs. Henderson froze. She asked Sandra to explain what she meant. And Sandra explained, with direct words, no beating around the bush, as only a young person who has lost all innocence can speak. She said her father had been committing crimes against her since she was very young. That it happened constantly. That it wasn't just him, but all the men in the house. That there were other children suffering the same. Mrs. Henderson, trembling, told Sandra to wait right there. She ran to the principal's office and immediately called social services. Within an hour, a social worker named Dale Morrison arrived at the school. Dale was 30 years old and had worked in the Child Protection Department for 5 years. She had seen many difficult cases, but when she began talking with Sandra, she realized this was something entirely different. Dale didn't rush Sandra, she didn't pressure her. She just listened. And Sandra told her everything. Each adult involved. Each type of violence. The daily routine of victimization. Wanda. The outsiders brought in to choose children. The total absence of protection or hope. Dale knew she could not send Sandra back home. She made some calls, and within hours, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Canada's Mounted Police, was involved. 2 officers were assigned, Constable James McNeil and Constable Patricia Decker. Both had experience in child abuse cases, but nothing had prepared them for what they were about to discover. On the night of January 21st, Sandra did not return home. For the first time in her life, she slept in a safe place, a temporary foster home maintained by social services. At the Goler property, Sandra's absence was immediately noticed. William interrogated Donna and Lisa. Where was their sister? What had she done? The girls didn't know, but William's instinct told him something was very wrong. The next day, January 22nd, William received confirmation of his worst fears. The school principal called, informing him that Sandra would not be returning home, that she was in protective custody, that serious accusations were being investigated. William flew into a rage. He gathered all the children in the house. He said, with that menacing calm that was more frightening than any scream, that if anyone talked to the police, the consequences would be terrible. Donna, now 12 years old, was terrified, not for herself, but for Lisa, her 8-year-old younger sister. Donna had practically raised Lisa after their mother left. She felt responsible for protecting her. She promised herself she wouldn't say anything, that she would keep the family together, that she would protect Lisa however she could. But on January 23rd, when she arrived at school, Donna was called to the principal's office. Constables McNeil and Decker were there. Donna stiffened, crossed her arms, refused to speak. The officers were patient. They explained that Sandra was safe, that they wanted to help, that Donna didn't need to be afraid. Donna remained silent. Then, Constable Decker said something that changed everything. She explained that Lisa would also be protected, that they would take care of her, but that they needed Donna to tell the truth. Donna wavered. She looked at the two adults. She saw something in their eyes she had never seen before, genuine compassion. And she began to speak. The story Donna told that afternoon completely corroborated Sandra's account. The same names, the same patterns, the same horrors. Two independent testimonies, from two children who hadn't spoken to each other, with identical details. The officers knew they had a solid case. On the afternoon of January 23, 1984, a police operation was organized. For patrol cars climbed the South Mountain Road toward Deep Hollow Road. The officers were tense. They knew the Goler family had a reputation for violence. They expected resistance, perhaps even an armed confrontation. When they arrived at the property, they found William outside, feeding the dog. He saw the patrol cars and didn't move. He just stood there, watching. Constable McNeil approached and announced that William was under arrest on suspicion of crimes against minors. William smiled, not a nervous smile, but one of pure arrogance. He extended his wrists for the handcuffs and said there was no problem, that they would resolve this at the station. He truly believed he could manipulate the officers, that his superior intelligence, at least compared to other family members, would be enough to let him escape. William was taken to the police station in Kentville. During the initial interrogation, he denied everything with impressive conviction. He said his daughters had mental problems, that they made up stories, that he was a hard-working father just trying to support a large family in difficult conditions. But the officers had heard all this before, and they had the testimonies of two children who could not have invented such specific and consistent details. William was formally charged and held in custody. And then the investigation expanded. While William was imprisoned, other officers returned to the property with warrants to remove all the children. One by one, the 13 victims were taken from the house and placed in emergency foster care. Donna and Lisa were reunited with Sandra. The three sisters hugged and cried. But there was a catastrophic failure in this rescue operation. Doug, a 14-year-old cousin of Sandra and Donna, was not removed from the property with the others. There is no clear explanation in the official records about why this happened. Perhaps because he was older, social workers assumed he was safe. Perhaps it was simply an administrative error. Whatever the reason, Doug remained in the house, alone with the broken furniture, the filthy mattresses, and the memories. In the following days, each child was interviewed separately by social workers and specialized psychologists. The stories that emerged were consistent and devastating. All reported victimization. All named the same adults. All described the same atmosphere of terror and control. On January 28, less than a week after Sandra's first report, police returned to the Goler property with arrest warrants for 14 additional adults. One by one, they were detained: Henry Goler, Cranwick Goler, Stella Goler Jr., Marjorie Goler, Josephine Goler, Mary Goler, Roy Hiltz, Lawrence Johnston, Eugene Brown, Ralph Kelly, Sinclair Gildry, Charlie Goler Jr., and Wanda Winston. When they came to arrest Wanda, she was sitting in the living room, holding her rag doll. She looked at the officers and asked, in a childish voice, what she had done wrong. The officers announced the charges: crimes against 8 children, 4 boys and 4 girls, with ages ranging from very young to 12 years old. Wanda showed no emotion. She just asked if she could take the doll with her. The interrogations that followed were surreal. William continued to deny everything. He maintained his posture of offended innocence. He insisted he was the victim of a conspiracy. But the other family members didn't have the same ability to dissemble. Cranwick, in particular, left the investigators astounded. When asked about the crimes against the children, he simply laughed. He showed no embarrassment or hesitation. He confirmed everything with a disturbing naturalness, as if he were discussing something trivial, like the weather. When pressed about why he thought this was acceptable, Cranwick responded with a distorted logic, that it was normal in his family, that everyone did it, that he saw no problem. The investigators, trying to maintain their professionalism despite the shock, asked specific questions. They asked about Annie, one of the youngest victims. Cranwick's response was even more disturbing. He admitted trying to harm the small child, but explained casually that she was too small physically for him to complete the act. He spoke of this as if it were merely a technical inconvenience, not a moral atrocity. There was no shame in his voice, no guilt in his posture, no recognition that this was monstrous. For Cranwick, it was simply how things were. Other family members gave equally shocking responses. They admitted to the acts without hesitation. Some went further, trying to justify their crimes by blaming the victims themselves. They claimed the children were provocative, that they displayed inappropriate behavior, that they had initiated the contact. These were grotesque arguments, but they revealed something important. They knew they needed a justification, which meant that at some deep level, they knew it was wrong. Roy Hiltz, William's brother-in-law, starred in one of the most bizarre moments of the interrogations. When the investigator used the word incest, Roy seemed genuinely confused. He repeated the word incorrectly, confusing it with insect. The investigator had to correct him, patiently explaining that he was asking about inappropriate relations with family members. Roy was silent for a moment, processing. Then he confirmed that yes, that happened, and that yes, everyone in the family did it. This wasn't calculated stupidity. It wasn't a defense strategy. Roy simply did not know the word. He had never been exposed to the concept that it had a specific name, that it was a crime, that it was a universal taboo. The interviews revealed a family completely disconnected from all moral or legal norms. Generations of isolation had created their own culture, an alternative reality where these acts were so normalized they weren't even recognized as wrong. But recognition or not, crimes had been committed. The children had suffered. And Canadian law made no exceptions for cultural ignorance. And then, the 15 adults were released on bail. The judge's decision shocked the investigators, but legally, the accused had no prior criminal history. They didn't represent a flight risk, according to technical criteria. The law allowed for bail, and so, one by one, they returned to the property. They returned to Deep Hollow Road to await their trials. And Doug was still there. What happened in the following weeks is difficult to fully document. Doug never spoke publicly about that period, but later medical records show he was taken to the hospital with serious injuries. Social workers finally removed him from the property. The adults, when questioned about Doug's injuries, claimed he had fallen, that he had hurt himself. Nobody believed them, but nobody was charged either. Doug was considered an unreliable witness, and there was no other evidence beyond his own account. It was one of the biggest failures of the entire case. A child, clearly identified as a victim, was left exactly where the predators could reach him again. How did this happen? How, in an operation that rescued 13 children, was one simply forgotten? How did social workers, trained to protect the most vulnerable, leave a traumatized teenager alone in a house where 15 criminals were about to return? There is no satisfactory answer. It is an inexplicable and unforgivable failure. And Doug paid the price for this negligence with additional weeks of suffering that should never have happened. February 1984 brought heavy snow to Nova Scotia, but in the Kentville courts, the atmosphere was even colder. The 15 arrested adults were presented at a preliminary hearing. Prosecutors presented a total of 170 criminal charges: aggravated abuse, incest, physical assault, exploitation of minors. It was one of the largest systematic abuse cases ever documented in Canada. The media quickly picked up the story. Newspapers from Halifax, Toronto, and Montreal sent reporters. The CBC, Canada's public broadcaster, deployed teams for continuous coverage. The labeled hillbilly crime ring began appearing in headlines. The Goler case became a national sensation. The defense faced monumental challenges. How do you defend clients who have openly confessed? How do you explain a culture so removed from modern civilization? Lawyers requested psychological evaluations. The results were revealing. All of the accused adults had significantly below average IQs. Most functioned intellectually at the level of 8 to 10-year-old children. Educational tests showed that most were functionally illiterate. They couldn't identify traffic signs. They couldn't fill out simple forms. They lived in a drastically limited cognitive world. The defense argued that the defendants lacked the mental capacity to understand the gravity of their acts. That they had been raised in a segregated culture where such behaviors were normalized. The prosecution countered that ignorance is no excuse, especially when there was evidence that the defendants knew their actions were wrong. After all, they had threatened the children not to tell anyone. The judge decided the defendants were mentally capable of standing trial. The proceedings would continue. Of the 15 accused, 14 chose to make plea deals. They admitted guilt in exchange for reduced sentences. They didn't want to go through the embarrassment of a public trial. Only William Goler insisted on going to a jury. He remained convinced he could manipulate the system. William Goler's trial began in April 1984. It was one of the most followed cases in recent Nova Scotian history. When William entered the courtroom on the first day, he caused general surprise. He was unrecognizable. The dirty, slovenly mountain man had disappeared. In his place was a man wearing a dark suit, his hair neatly combed, holding a Bible. William announced to the court that he had undergone a spiritual transformation during his imprisonment, that he had found Jesus Christ, that he was repentant of his sins and sought redemption. His strategy was clear: to try and win sympathy from the jury by presenting himself as a reformed man. But the prosecution wasn't fooled. They presented testimony after testimony: social workers, doctors who had examined the children, psychologists. And then, the victims themselves were called. Sandra was called first. She was 14 years old, but she looked older. Her eyes were those of someone who had seen far too much. When she entered the room and saw her father sitting at the defense table, holding that Bible, something broke inside her. She began to tremble. She had difficulty speaking. The prosecutor was gentle, asking simple questions. Sandra tried to answer, but the words came out broken. She began to cry. She asked for a break. During the recess, Sandra told the social worker she couldn't continue, that she didn't have the strength to face her father. But then it was Donna's turn. Donna was 12 years old, younger than Sandra, but somehow more resilient, or perhaps just more determined. When she entered the courtroom, she looked directly at William. She didn't look away, she didn't waver. The prosecutor asked the questions. Donna answered with impressive, chilling clarity. She detailed years of victimization, named the perpetrators, described the routine of terror. William tried to intimidate her. He fixed his gaze on her. At one point, he moved his lips silently, forming threatening words that only Donna could see. Donna saw him, her eyes filled with tears, but she did not stop. She kept talking. She kept testifying. When she finished, the courtroom was in absolute silence. The defense tried to discredit the children. They argued they were mentally unstable, that they had reasons to invent stories, that they weren't reliable witnesses. But the jury saw through it. They were 12 ordinary people, fathers and mothers, grandparents. They looked at those children, and they saw the truth. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty on all charges. William Goler was found guilty of 7 counts of aggravated abuse, incest, and assault. Sentencing would be determined in the following weeks. While awaiting sentencing, William gave interviews to journalists. He continued to deny everything. He said he was unjustly persecuted, that his daughters had betrayed him, that God would vindicate him. He carried the Bible everywhere. He quoted verses. He presented himself as a Christian martyr. But in the surrounding community, nobody bought his performance. In June 1984, the moment of sentencing arrived. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, social workers, curious onlookers, all wanted to know how long these monsters would spend behind bars. William Goler was the first to be sentenced, 7 years in a medium-security federal prison. The prosecution had asked for 15 years. Activists demanded life imprisonment. But 7 years was what the judge determined, claiming it was the maximum allowed by the era's guidelines for that type of crime. It was the heaviest sentence of the entire case. The others would receive less. Much less. Wanda Winston, who had victimized 8 children for 5 consecutive years, received only 4 years, less time imprisoned than the time she had spent committing the crimes. Cranwick Goler, described by investigators as the most violent and sadistic of them all, received 5.5 years. He would be eligible for parole in less than 3. Henry Goler, who had also actively participated, received 3 years. Roy Hiltz, who had perpetrated crimes against children as young as 7, received only 1 year. 12 months. The family women, Josephine and Mary, who had held the children down while the men acted, received 1 year each. They would be released in mere months for good behavior. The other participants, brothers-in-law, neighbors, strangers who had been invited to choose children in exchange for cigarettes, received sentences ranging from 6 months to 2 years. When the last sentence was announced, a heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Outside, on the courthouse steps, child rights activists protested, shouting that the system had failed, that those sentences were an insult to the victims. But legally, there was nothing more to be done. The sentences were within the legal parameters. All the convicted were sent to federal prisons. And the children? They were distributed through foster homes throughout Nova Scotia. Sandra, Donna, and Lisa, the 3 sisters, were separated. No family wanted to adopt all 3 together. They were considered too difficult with cases. They carried deep traumas. They would require years of therapy. Sandra went to a family in Halifax. Donna to another in Truro. Lisa to a third in Wolfville. They saw each other occasionally at supervised meetings, but the closeness they had, the bond forged in shared suffering, began to dissolve. The other children from the clan were also separated and scattered. Some were adopted, others remained in the foster system until adulthood. All received psychological counseling, but the therapist said those children carried scars that would never completely heal. Meanwhile, the Goler property on South Mountain remained empty. The decaying house became a morbid curiosity. Some young people visited at night, seeking thrills. Others avoided passing by the road entirely. The community tried to forget, but the Goler name was now engraved in the collective consciousness. A Canadian documentary was filmed in 1985, titled On South Mountain. It showed interviews with family members, including William, still protesting his innocence. It showed the house, the surroundings, the poverty. And in one of the documentary's most disturbing scenes, Marjorie Goler, William's sister and a victim's grandmother, appeared defending the family. She spoke directly to the camera with an expression of genuine indignation. She blamed Sandra for reporting. She said the girl had destroyed the family, that before the police came, everyone lived just fine, that Sandra was the traitor, the liar, responsible for everything. She showed no concern whatsoever for the victimized children. She didn't acknowledge that crimes had been committed. Her only concern was the destruction of the family. It was the final evidence of how utterly distorted the Goler clan's moral reality was. Even the grandmother, who should have been the natural protector of her granddaughters, had chosen the side of the criminals. The documentary shocked the entire country. It provoked national debates about rural poverty, failures in the child protection system, and the limits of social responsibility. Canadians, accustomed to seeing themselves as a progressive and safe society, were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality: a family had victimized children for generations, less than 2 hours away from modern, prosperous cities. The documentary forced the nation to look in the mirror and ask, in how many other places is this happening right now? How many other children, on remote farms and in isolated communities, are suffering while everyone around them chooses not to see? But the questions remained largely unanswered. The years passed. The headlines disappeared. The Goler case faded from the public consciousness. But for those involved, time brought no forgetting. William Goler served his sentence and was released in 1991, after 7 years. He immediately returned to South Mountain. The family house was still there, increasingly ruined, but still standing. Some of the other clan members also returned after serving their sentences. Wanda Winston was released in 1988, Cranwick in 1989, Henry in 1987. Gradually, the Goler clan regrouped. Not all of them, but several. They returned to Deep Hollow Road as if nothing had ever happened. The community was horrified. People who lived in the valley, who had followed the trial, who knew exactly who these people were, now saw them on the streets, occasionally at the hardware store, at the gas station, buying groceries. There were conversations about organizing protests, about forcing the Golers to leave. But legally, there was nothing they could do. The sentences had been served. The crimes had, technically, been paid for. And so, the Golers remained. Ghosts living in the mountain's shadows. Sandra, William's oldest daughter, had a torturous path. In adolescence, she struggled with severe depression. She attempted suicide twice. She was admitted to psychiatric units. At 18, she made a decision that shocked her social workers. She tried to return to the Goler family. She showed up on Deep Hollow Road, asking to be taken back. Perhaps it was a form of Stockholm Syndrome. Perhaps she simply didn't know how to exist outside of that grim reality. Perhaps she was seeking some kind of closure she would never find. But William rejected her. He said she was a traitor, that because of her the family had been destroyed, that she was no longer welcome. Sandra left, more lost than before. In the following years, she drifted between small Nova Scotia towns, temporary jobs, abusive relationships, addictions. Her story ends in a silent tragedy. Data about her whereabouts or her final fate are not public. Records indicate she lived until at least the late 1990s, but after that, nothing. Donna had a different trajectory. Despite the traumas, or perhaps because of them, she developed a remarkable inner strength. At 21, she was in a relationship with a man who violated her. She became pregnant. When the child was born, the man demanded custody. And, incredibly, a judge granted it. The argument was that Donna, as a Goler clan survivor, was genetically and psychologically unsuited for motherhood. It was a cruel echo of the past. Once again, the system was failing her. But Donna fought. She hired a lawyer. She appealed. And finally, after 2 years, she regained custody of her son. She met another man, this one gentle and understanding. They married. They had another child. Donna got work as a nursing assistant. She dedicated herself to caring for others, channeling her own pain into compassion for those who were suffering. She also became an activist. She gave interviews. She gave lectures. She pressed for changes in the law. In the following years, Donna led campaigns to strengthen penalties for crimes against minors. She argued that sentences of 1 or 2 years were a mockery of justice, that predators needed to be kept away from children for a significant amount of time. Thanks to her efforts, some laws were revised. Not everything she wanted, but it was something. Minimum sentences were increased. Post-prison monitoring was strengthened. Offender registration was expanded. Donna carried her story publicly, without shame. In interviews, she spoke openly about what she had suffered, not out of masochism, but because she believed silence was dangerous. Years later, in an article published in a local newspaper, she wrote about the importance of not forgetting. She explained that when societies choose to erase uncomfortable memories, when they prefer to pretend certain horrors never happened, they create the very conditions for those horrors to repeat themselves. She emphasized that other children, at that very moment, could be suffering on isolated properties while the adults around them chose not to see. Donna also returned once to South Mountain. It was in the late 1990s. She drove slowly down Deep Hollow Road, looking out the window. The house was still there, more deteriorated, but standing. And there was something that made Donna's heart stop: toys in the yard. A rusted red tricycle. A faded plastic ball. A one-armed doll thrown in the grass. Toys. Children. Donna parked the car and sat there, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. Her first instinct was to get out, knock on the door, demand to see if there were children living there. Her second instinct was to run away and never return. In the end, she did the only thing she could: she grabbed her cell phone and called the police. She reported that there were toys on the Goler property, that she feared there were children living there, that they needed to investigate immediately. The police investigated. And in 1999, William Goler was arrested again. This time, the charges involved a new generation. Specific details were never fully disclosed to the public, but court records indicate that at least 2 small children were in the custody of clan members when the police arrived. William faced a new trial. He was convicted again. This time, he received a sentence of 12 years. He was sent to a medium-security federal prison. Prison records indicate William remained incarcerated until at least 2011. After that, there is no public information. There is speculation he died in prison, but no obituary was published, no news was released. William Goler simply disappeared from the records. Wanda Winston disappeared from public records after her second release in 2000. Her whereabouts are unknown. There are no death records, no new arrests. It is as if she simply evaporated. Lisa, the youngest of the 3 sisters, is the most enigmatic. There is almost no information about her. She was adopted by a family in rural Nova Scotia, and that family kept her identity fiercely protected. There is an unconfirmed report that Lisa legally changed her name, completed secondary education, and moved to another province, but this cannot be verified. Whether she found peace, nobody knows. And perhaps that is better. Perhaps anonymity is her final gift. The other children from the clan, the cousins, the nephews, also disappeared into anonymity. Some were adopted and assumed new identities. Others entered adulthood and simply vanished from the public records. Doug, the boy who was left behind when all the others were arrested, never spoke publicly about his experience. Records indicate he was placed in foster care after finally being rescued, but after that, nothing. A book was written about the case in 1997, on South Mountain, The Dark Secrets of the Goler Clan by David Cruz and Alison Griffiths. It is the most complete source on the case, based on interviews, court records, and testimonies. The book is hard to find. Few libraries keep it. It is out of print. Used copies are sold online for hundreds of dollars. There is a theory that this was intentional, that there was a deliberate effort to suppress the story, to prevent the Goler name from continuing to circulate, to allow the victims to live their lives without being constantly identified. The property on South Mountain was eventually abandoned. The house slowly crumbled. Today, little remains beyond rotted foundations and debris covered by the relentless vegetation. Deep Hollow Road still exists, but nobody lives there. It is a road to nowhere. In Kentville and the neighboring towns, the Goler name still provokes chills. People who lived through the 1980s remember. But for younger generations, it is a forgotten history, a nightmare that time has buried. There is no memorial, no plaque. Nothing marks the place where those horrors occurred. It is as if society had collectively decided to erase the memory, to bury the past along with the rubble. But for the victims, there is no forgetting. There is a debate about whether cases like the Golers should be remembered or forgotten. Some argue that keeping the memory alive only perpetuates the suffering, that the victims deserve peace, not constant reminders. Others argue the exact opposite, that forgetting is dangerous, that when societies choose not to look at their past horrors, they create the conditions for those horrors to be repeated. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The individual victims deserve their privacy and their peace. But our collective history needs to be remembered, not out of morbidity, not for sensationalism, but as a necessary reminder of the vigilance we must maintain. Because the Goler case did not happen in a vacuum. It was the product of multiple systemic failures, geographic isolation, extreme poverty, a profound lack of education, social stigmatization that prevented intervention, and, mainly, the collective choice not to see what was happening right before their eyes. And that is perhaps the most important lesson of all. That evil like this does not thrive on its own. It thrives when good people choose not to act. Children cannot protect themselves. They depend on adults who choose to see, who choose to hear, who choose to act. Sandra, Donna, Lisa, and all the other children of the Goler clan asked for help for years. They were silenced, time and time again, until a single teacher decided to listen. A social worker decided to believe. 2 police officers decided to investigate. And that made all the difference. It was too late to save the childhoods that had already been destroyed, but it was not too late to save lives. The Goler clan victims survived. Not all of them intact, not all of them happy, but they are alive. And some, like Donna, transformed their pain into purpose. They became voices for those who cannot speak. That is perhaps the only glimmer of light in this profoundly dark story. Today, South Mountain remains as beautiful as it is dangerously silent. Tourists visit the region for the scenery. They walk the trails. They admire the panoramic views of the Annapolis Valley. Few know the story that is buried there. Deep Hollow Road was renamed. More recent maps don't even show the path. It is almost as if it never existed. But it did exist. And the scars remain. In the Kentville Court archives, dusty boxes hold the records, thousands of pages of testimonies, medical evaluations, psychiatric reports. They document, with clinical and cold detail, the full extent of the suffering. They prove that it happened, that it was real. But almost nobody accesses those archives anymore. They are relics of a nightmare that society prefers to forget. The last public mention of the Goler case was in 2011, when a local newspaper published a brief article about the 30th anniversary of the initial investigation. The article was 3 paragraphs long. It didn't mention any names. It didn't go into details. It was like an epitaph, short, vague, and utterly forgettable. But the victims have not forgotten. They carry the memories every day, in their nightmares, in unexpected triggers, in the difficulties they have with trusting, with loving, with simply living. Some manage to build relatively normal lives. Others still struggle. And some, like Sandra possibly was, were consumed by the darkness. There is no happy ending to this story. There is no complete redemption. There is no true justice. There is only the naked truth that human beings are capable of incomprehensible evil, and that this evil, when allowed to thrive unchecked, creates victims who never fully recover. The Goler clan was a product of geographic isolation, extreme poverty, inbreeding, ignorance, and systematic social failure. But mainly, it was a product of choices. Choices made by adults who knew, at some level, that they were causing immense suffering. William Goler chose to commit his crimes. Wanda Winston chose to commit her atrocities. Cranwick, Henry, all the others, they chose. And the surrounding society chose to ignore. That is the complete tragedy. It was not inevitable. It could have been stopped decades earlier if someone had looked. If someone had cared. But they didn't look. They didn't care. Until a 14-year-old girl, broken but not completely defeated, decided she couldn't take it anymore. And she spoke. Sandra Goler, with all her pain and all her trauma, saved the other children. Her act of courage triggered everything that came after. Donna, at 12 years old, reinforced Sandra's truth. She stood firm. She testified. Together, they brought down William Goler's empire of terror. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough. And perhaps that is what we can learn from this. That even in the very darkest of places, even in the most desperate of situations, the courage of one person can make a difference. A teacher who listens. A social worker who believes. A police officer who investigates. A child who speaks. Every single individual choice matters. The Goler Clan is a horror story. But it is also a story of survival. Those who walked away from that mountain carry scars, but they also carry a strength that ordinary people cannot comprehend. They survived hell. And some, like Donna, came back to testify, to ensure that it would not be forgotten. Our role is to remember. Not out of morbidity. Not for sensationalism. But because forgetting is a form of complicity. Because silence is a form of permission. And as long as there are children suffering in silence, in remote mountains, in suburban houses, in urban apartments, we must continue to look, to listen, and to act. The echo of South Mountain's winds continues to resonate, for those who are willing to hear it. Teachers saw. Police heard. Neighbors knew. Everyone failed. The victims screamed. Finally, someone listened. May we all choose to listen. If this investigation has impacted you, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Cases like this cannot be allowed to fade into oblivion. And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, hit that subscribe button right now, because there are more untold stories that need to be brought into the light. And I need you here with me to make sure these voices are never, ever silenced again. Subscribe. Comment. Share. Let's make sure that stories like Sandra's and Donna's are never, ever forgotten. Thank you for watching. Until the next investigation.